Okay, ready for a deep dive into something that might kind of flip the script on how we see bouncing back?
Flipping the script, I like that.
We're tackling resilience, but maybe not how we usually think about it.
Right, because it's not always that simple.
Exactly. We're diving into Michael Ungar's work, especially his book, The Limits of Resilience. He really digs into those tricky parts of bouncing back.
What's interesting is he doesn't just focus on, individual grit. He looks at the bigger picture of resilience.
So it's not just about how tough you are as a person.
No, it's about families, communities, whole systems even. And that's where it gets really interesting because sometimes what makes one part resilient can actually make things harder for other parts.
So it's like too much of a good thing almost. We always think of resilience as good, but what if it backfires?
That's the paradox Ungar wants us to think about. It's not that resilience is bad, but it's way more complicated than we realize. One of the first things he questions is this idea of bouncing back.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about getting back to how things were before. I'll be honest, that's what I usually think of with resilience.
Right, but Ungar says just recovering isn't always the goal. Sometimes it's more about adapting, changing completely, even accepting the new normal.
Accepting the new normal, okay.
Yeah, and he uses the example of Drayton Valley. It's a town in Canada all about the oil industry.
Oh, so like a classic boom and bust situation. What happened when the busts hit?
At first, every time there was an oil bust, they just wanted to go back to depending on oil. But they finally realized that wasn't going to work.
Like you can't keep falling into the same trap and expecting different results.
Exactly. For Drayton Valley, it meant changing their whole economy, embracing new industries, even if it meant leaving the old ways behind.
Wow, that's a huge shift. And I guess that takes more than just willpower, right?
Oh.
Like, I can't just wish myself a new job if there aren't any.
You got it. Ungar uses this great analogy. He compares it to recovering from a car accident. You don't just walk it off. You rely on a bunch of systems: police, insurance, doctors, even your friends and family.
Right, we rely on others all the time, whether we realize it or not. Even something as personal as resilience is connected to the systems around us. Families, communities, everything. But that's where it gets tricky too, right?
Definitely. Because this whole interconnected thing can backfire. Sometimes what helps one system be resilient makes things worse for another, even for itself later on.
Okay, so let's get into those uncomfortable truths. Ungar uses the example of schools closing during COVID. Seems simple at first, right? Protect everyone from the virus.
Right, trying to keep everyone safe.
But it also shows how complicated resilience is. Trying to protect one system, public health, it made us ask about other systems. Did being out of school hurt kids' education, their development? What about their mental health? It made us face a tough question: whose resilience matters more? Such a tough question. And then there's the whole thing with people not getting vaccinated. Some saw that as being resilient, like protecting their own choices.
Right, making their own decisions.
But did that impact the healthcare system? Did it make schools close longer, hurting kids even more? This is what Ungar calls resilience silos. Like different parts of a company so focused on their own goals that they don't work together.
They forget about the bigger picture.
Exactly. That focus on one part's resilience, not the whole thing, it creates blind spots.
It's a reminder that even with good intentions, trying to be resilient in one area can accidentally mess things up somewhere else. It's complicated, there are moral questions, and we can't ignore that.
Absolutely. Seeing those tensions, those tough choices within resilience, that's so important. There's no right answer, no magic solution. It's about seeing the whole picture and how everything's connected.
So, where do we even start with this? How do we move past just general ideas about resilience and see how nuanced it really is? Well, Ungar has a helpful way of thinking about this. He lays out 5 different ways that systems show resilience, and they each have their good and bad sides.
5 ways. Okay, I'm listening. What's the first one?
First up is persistence. Think of a marathon runner who just keeps their pace, doesn't give up even when it's tough.
Okay, persistence, staying the course, not giving in. I can see how that's valuable, but also maybe limiting if you're holding on to something that's not working anymore.
You got it. And a perfect example of this is Faber-Castell. They've been making pencils since 1761.
1761? I mean, that's older than the United States. How have they stayed afloat for so long?
It's not just luck. They've adapted, but they've stayed true to their core values too.
So they haven't just been making the same old pencils this whole time.
Right. When demand for regular pencils went down, they switched to fancy art supplies, high-end pens. They basically became a luxury brand, found a whole new market.
So persistence, but with flexibility, keeping up with the times. That takes awareness, a willingness to change.
Exactly. But even that's not always enough. Sometimes systems have to push back harder against change, and that's where resistance comes in.
Resistance, that feels more active, even defiant, like a tree in a hurricane.
Yeah, like digging in your heels?
Can be powerful, but what if the force against you is just too strong?
Good point. And a great example of this is that trucker convoy in Canada, the one protesting the COVID mandate.
Oh yeah, that was huge.
They were dealing with lockdowns, those vaccine requirements, gas prices going crazy. It seemed like everything was against them.
And they chose to resist.
They did. They made their voices heard. But like you said, there's a risk there. Resistance only works if you can keep it up. And sometimes the system is too big to beat.
Think of those movements that seem like they're gaining ground, then just fade away.
Right, maybe the pressure's too much, or they lose their unity, or maybe what they're fighting is just too ingrained to change.
So resistance is powerful, but not always sustainable. Maybe not even the smartest move sometimes. It's about choosing your battles, knowing when to stand strong and when to switch tactics. Which brings us to adaptation. Things are getting more dynamic here, right?
Definitely. Adaptation is adjusting, like those desert plants that thrive in the dry heat. They're still plants, but they've changed to survive, even flourish, in a tough environment.
So making the best of it.
Right. And a really cool example of this is the paramedics in Renfrew County.
In Ontario.
Yeah, they had a shortage of medical staff during COVID.
Oh yeah, that was a problem everywhere. They couldn't just keep doing things the same way, could they?
Exactly. Instead of just trying to do the same work with fewer people, they got creative. They started doing more checkups for non-emergencies, go into people's homes, even set up a website so people could talk to a doctor online.
So they adapted their whole approach to fit the situation. That's smart.
It was. But remember how we were saying that adapting doesn't always mean you succeed?
Yeah, what happens when you adjust, but it doesn't work out how you wanted?
Ungar talks about this program. They had a wound care app to help nurses in rural areas.
Okay, using technology to reach people.
Exactly. But they had problems with the internet being unreliable, so the app developers fixed that. The nurses loved it, said it made their work better, but it didn't actually improve the patient's health.
Wait, really? How's that possible?
It shows that even when you adapt well, you have to think about the whole picture. There were probably other issues, like transportation, other health problems, that the app couldn't fix.
It's like putting on a bandage without treating the actual infection underneath.
That's a great way to put it.
So adaptation is important, but sometimes you need a bigger change, which brings us to transformation.
Exactly. Transformation is about disrupting everything, creating completely new systems or changing the old ones so much they're barely recognizable, like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, a total makeover.
And the classic example is Uber, right? It totally changed the taxi industry.
They did. And for people who needed rides, it was often a good change. Easier to get a ride, prices were clearer, especially in cities where the taxis had gotten, well, a little too comfortable.
I'm thinking of a few cities known for their cash-only taxis who just happen to forget their credit card machines.
Right. Those systems were ready for a change. But here's the thing about transformation. There are always winners and losers. It was good for riders, but not so much for taxi drivers who'd invested a lot of money in those medallions and permits.
Well, progress isn't always pretty, but even if Uber wasn't a perfect example of ethical disruption, they did change how we think about transportation.
They did, and that's led to so much innovation. Ride-sharing, electric cars, even self-driving cars. Transformation can be messy, but it can also drive progress.
It's about understanding that progress often shakes things up, makes us ask whose needs are being met and whose are being ignored, which leads us to that last type of resilience, wear and tear.
This one's interesting because it makes us rethink this idea that resilience is always good. Wear and tear is about the hidden cost of being resilient, the toll it takes when we're constantly adapting, overcoming, never getting a break.
It's like that friend who always seems to be pushing through, but they never really slow down. They seem super resilient, but are they just exhausted underneath it all?
Exactly. And Ungar talks about this study on high-achieving Black youth. These kids seemed incredibly resilient. They were doing great in school, had strong friendships, but they had physical signs of stress. High blood pressure, stress hormones through the roof. Their resilience was costing them something.
Wow, so even though they were thriving in a system not really designed for them, it was affecting their well-being, even if you couldn't see it right away. It shows that resilience isn't just about being mentally tough, it's about knowing your limits, physical and emotional.
And that brings us to a really important point. Resilience isn't a destination. It's a journey, and it's not always a journey we choose.
So we've gone through these 5 phases of resilience, persistence, resistance, adaptation, transformation, and wear and tear. 5 different ways systems handle change, each with their own quirks and potential downsides. It's a lot to process. If resilience isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, where do we even start using this knowledge in our own lives?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Ungar doesn't give us easy answers, because there aren't any. But he does offer a really powerful shift in thinking. He wants us to move away from this idea of resilience as some sort of achievement, like a fortress we build and then we're safe. Instead, he sees it as a process, a back and forth between being stable and changing, being okay with the messiness of it all.
So less about toughening up, more about learning to deal with the ups and downs.
Exactly. And a big part of that is questioning our assumptions, even the ones that seem like they'll never change. For example, we usually think of optimism as a good thing.
Right. Who doesn't like a positive outlook?
Right. But Ungar, he brings up this idea from Lauren Berlant, the concept of cruel optimism.
Cruel optimism. Okay, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. What does that even mean?
Imagine holding on to a hope, a dream, even when everything's telling you it's not going to happen. That feeling of, if I just keep trying, keep believing, it'll all work out.
And sometimes it does.
It does, but sometimes that stubborn optimism stops us from seeing other options, from accepting a reality we don't want to see.
It's like keeping a dead plant on life support when you could be planting something new that can actually thrive.
Exactly. Ungar connects this back to our talk about Amanda Lindau, the journalist who was kidnapped in Somalia.
Her story is incredible.
It is a testament to what humans can endure. But if we only focus on that, her ultimate triumph, we might miss part of the resilience picture.
Because she chose that path. She went there knowing the risks.
Exactly. Celebrating her story, which we should, could make us think anyone can overcome anything, that it's all about willpower. But that's not the whole story. It ignores the systems, the inequalities, the lack of choice that many people face. It could actually make us less resilient, less able to deal with a world where we don't always get to pick our battles.
Right. It's not always a level playing field. So celebrating individual stories is important, but we have to remember the bigger context.
Yes, and it reminds me of another important point Ungar makes: the potential downsides of too many rules in the name of resilience. We often think rules and regulations keep us safe, especially when things are uncertain, and they often do. But Ungar warns against systems that become so rigid, so focused on avoiding any risk, that they actually stifle creativity, innovation, and, ironically, resilience itself.
It's like those parents who overprotect their kids, trying to prevent every little injury. They end up with kids who are scared to try new things, explore, to actually learn and grow.
Perfect analogy. Ungar talks about building codes that are now so complicated and restrictive that they discourage new ideas in construction and design. These codes, they're supposed to make sure things are safe and well made, but they've accidentally created a system that values the status quo over progress.
So it's about finding a balance, isn't it? Protecting the things we value while also making space to grow and change.
Exactly. And sometimes that means accepting that there's no perfect answer, no guaranteed outcome. Sometimes resilience is about being okay with uncertainty, being willing to adjust as we go, realizing that even our best efforts won't always get us the results we want.
That's a bit humbling, but also kind of freeing, wouldn't you say? If resilience isn't about reaching some perfect state of invincibility, but more about navigating this constant dance between stability and change, it makes it feel more achievable, maybe even empowering.
I think so. It makes me think about that thought-provoking question Ungar leaves us with. If resilience is more about the systems we're in than just our own strength, how can we identify and strengthen those systems? How do we nurture relationships, support communities, and advocate for policies that promote fairness and justice? Because ultimately, our individual resilience is tied to how resilient the world around us is.
That's a powerful message to end on. It reminds us that creating a more resilient world doesn't start with individual grit, but with recognizing how interconnected we all are and working together to make a difference. So next time you hear someone talk about resilience, remember, it's not about snapping back to some ideal, but about navigating the ever-changing tides of life with courage, compassion,